You will hear all the time when you tell people this on the internet or whatever, they're going to say, well, that's a correlation study. It's not causation. Correlation does not equal causation. And it is a correlation study. But here's the thing. There's a lot of them. There are a lot of correlation studies out there. And where there is smoke, there is fire. And the funny thing to me is you might hear like, oh, fat's good for you now. Like, oh, butter's good for you. You've heard this? The people that will argue with the most are the people that tell you that butter is good for you. And they'll say, that study that you just looked at, that's a correlation study. But the whole foundation that butter is good for you comes from a correlation study. The whole thing. They're so hypocritical in this manner. And that correlation study was not done with the rigor that this study was. And it was funded by dairy and egg and beef. And they did all kinds of crazy statistical manipulations in order to show a correlation that didn't even show that butter is good for you, just showed maybe it wasn't as bad as we thought, but it is. That's another topic. But I mean, no matter what you look at with animal fat, if you look at different countries, the more they eat, the more cancer they have, and the more heart disease they have. And when you look at the people that are arguing that fat is good or that meat is good for you, like Gary Taubes, these are not scientists, all right? These are journalists. They're not practicing medicine. Gary Taubes has never sat across from a person and followed them for years trying to help them lose weight. He doesn't know that struggle. And he says you need to eat like him to get fat. Well, he looks pretty peaked lately. And he put his labs up on the computer because he wanted to show people how healthy he was eating fat and protein. And the interesting thing is his protein levels are the same as my protein levels. So he doesn't have higher protein levels than I do. But if you look up there where it says carbon dioxide, his is at 19. Which is low. He doesn't know what that means because he's not a doctor. What that means is his body is in acidosis. It's metabolic acidosis. And what we know is that meat has more sulfur amino acids that are actually acidic to the body, and your body has to try to buffer that acid, and that creates all kinds of problems. And so he's not healthy. He thinks those labs look healthy, but he doesn't know what that 19 means. In fact, there have been many, many studies looking at vegetarians that are getting plant-based proteins. They're not getting any animal-based proteins. And you could see over there, this is a meta-analysis where they looked at a whole bunch of different studies, and they concluded that the overall cancer incidence was significantly lower in vegetarians compared to meat eaters. And in another meta-analysis, you could see that the plant-based eaters, these are risks adjusted. So if it's less than 1, that means there's a lower risk of it by percentages. So like for lung cancer, vegetarians had almost a 20% reduction in the risk of getting lung cancer. But look at heart disease. IHD is heart disease, ischemic heart disease, 0.76, a tremendous drop in the risk of heart disease in vegetarians. Now, people will tell you, okay, these are all correlation studies. If we're going to prove anything, we have to do a prospective randomized controlled trial, because that is our gold standard. The problem is you can't do that with food. It takes years and years and years to get heart disease. It takes years and years to get cancer. I can't take a group of you and say, you guys are going to be vegan, you guys are going to eat a lot of protein for the next 20 years, and 20 years later we're going to see the results. It just can't be done. They tried a 1-year study, which was called the A to Z trial, and this is it. And Atkins did the best with weight loss in the beginning, but by a year and a half, everyone had lost the same amount of weight, and it wasn't much weight loss. So they concluded that Atkins was the best, but it wasn't that much better than all the others. Here's the problem. The Atkins people did do the Atkins diet in the beginning, but then they started falling off of it, like people always do. The Ornish diet people, you guys know the Ornish diet, that's the vegan diet in this study. They never did it. So it's funny when you look at the data and you read it, the Ornish people, they got about 20 grams of fiber a day. If you guys have ever seen Ornish's meal plans, that should be 60 grams of fiber a day. And their fat went from 35% to 30%. So they dropped 5% fat. 30% fat is not what Ornish tells you to eat. He tells you to eat 10 to 15% fat. So they never followed an Ornish diet, which drove Ornish crazy, and which makes this study really worthless. It just basically says if people don't follow a diet, everybody gets the same result. And the funny thing about it is this is all really complex to tell you, but they compared these two studies, okay? And they were looking at people that were in ketosis and people weren't in ketosis. And they wanted to look at how much fat was burned when they exercised. And they saw that the people in ketosis burned more fat than the people that weren't in ketosis. And therefore, you should be in ketosis because you're going to burn more fat with exercise. Oh, okay, well then I'm going to go ketosis. Wait a second. They didn't look at, so in the first study where they weren't in ketosis, there were 300 people. In the study that they were in ketosis, there were 5 people. In the group that weren't in ketosis, they exercised for 15 to 30 minutes. In the other group, they exercised for 2 hours. 2 hours. These were overweight, untrained individuals. These were cyclists that were trained. So it's a totally different group. It's comparing apples and oranges, but to the layperson who doesn't know any better, they see this, they say, oh man, I better go on ketosis. And that's how they fool you. And in fact, we have to look at epidemiology because it's our best examples. And there have been some unbelievably fantastic, huge epidemiologic studies, like the EPIC study. The EPIC study looked at 10 countries, 500,000 people they followed for 12 years with meticulous analysis. And what do they find? Well, again, they find that vegans have the lowest weight. They find, funny enough, when you look at weight, that meat is one of the biggest indicators of gaining weight. And you know what meat is the biggest indicator of gaining weight? Chicken. Chicken is the biggest risk of gaining weight. In America, I tell patients that. They're like, what are you talking about? Chicken's our health food. Yeah, we eat a lot of chicken in this country, right? We eat more chickens than any other country in the world. How's it working for us? And why is that? It might be the growth hormones they're feeding the chickens. It might be that there's changes in the microbiome. It might be the estrogens. But all I know is we're eating a lot of chicken and we're getting fatter. And there's pretty good evidence that chicken is associated with weight gain. Chicken's also associated, incidentally, with lymphoma risk. And you can see that again because as our chicken consumption has gone up, so has our lymphoma risk. The other thing they found was that meat was very strongly correlated with diabetes, specifically animal protein. Plant protein, not so much. As you see there, the red line stays stable. Animal protein, the more animal protein you ate, the increased risk of getting diabetes. Because meat is actually a very big risk factor for diabetes. It's probably the biggest risk factor for diabetes. Now, in these studies, again, they control for weight, which is kind of crazy because weight is a big indicator for diabetes, and we know that vegans have the lowest weight. But still, people have the wrong concept of what causes diabetes. Diabetes is caused because of intramyocellular lipids, which means fat gets into the muscle cells. When they get into the muscle cells, they block the ability of the muscle cell to create insulin receptors. If you don't have insulin receptors, you can't process insulin. If you can't process insulin, sugar can't get into the cell. You can't utilize sugar. So you eat something with sugar, your sugar goes shooting up, and you say sugar's the problem. Sugar's not the problem. Your body's ability to process the sugar is the problem. And the body can't process the sugar because there's too much fat in the muscle. So in the study, in the EPIC study, they looked at it as a whole, and they said, if you decrease your saturated fatty acid consumption by just 5% and replace that 5% with fructose, which we think as poison here in America, you drop your risk of developing diabetes by 30%. A 5% reduction, substitute with fructose 30%. Glucose consumption, they were studying this big group of people. They say, whoever ate the most glucose you would think would have the most diabetes. No, the opposite. They had less of a risk of diabetes. Starches and sucrose are neutral. So it's absolutely opposite of what we think. But you got to remember, what we think isn't working very well. And it's a pretty good study. And you can see it in real world examples. Like if you look at China, their diabetes risk is going through the roof. And you know what else is going through their roof? Their meat consumption. The Pima Indians were a great example of this. The Pima Indians lived in Arizona on a river, and that river was dammed up. Now, before that river was dammed up, they grew starches, they ate squash and potatoes and beans, and they didn't have any diabetes. We dammed up their river, and we said, we're sorry, here is some meat subsidy and some junk food. And now they have the highest rate of diabetes anywhere. And if you look at their genetic relatives in Mexico, they don't have diabetes because they're still eating squash and maize and things like that. Now, in any kind of thing, there's epidemiologic studies. But you've got to take those epidemiologic studies, and then you've got to have a mechanism of action. So with diabetes, we said, okay, look, there seems to be that there's a correlation between meat and diabetes, and we think that's because there's fat inside the muscle cell, but can we do a randomized controlled trial to prove that? And so Neal Barnard did a study, boy, that's not coming through really well, but he did a study, and he randomized people, and he gave them, like for breakfast here, they're eating toast, oatmeal, and a cantaloupe. I mean, that's like opposite of what the American Dietetics Association would eat. And he's giving them a lunch with fruit and brown rice and vegetarian chili. Dinner's minestrone. Snack is an apple, and a banana. And so he's giving them fruit and grains, and this is exactly opposite. And then he compared them to people that were on the American Dietetic Association. And interestingly, there's been a lot of studies showing fruit is excellent for diabetes, actually improves diabetes. And cereal fiber is actually excellent and improves diabetes. And so when he does a randomized controlled trial, what does he find? Well, the blue line are the people on that diet, the vegan diet. The red line are the people on the American Dietetic Association. You can see there's a significantly more drop in blood sugar in the group that's on a vegan diet. So the EPIC study concluded with, they had a great study that kind of tried to tie everything together. I had mentioned this yesterday. 5 servings of fruit and vegetables saves you 4 years. Not smoking saves you 5 years. You do moderate exercise, it gives you 3. You do all of those, you get 10. Without alcohol, 14 years of added healthy life.